The cafeteria at Roosevelt High School buzzed with the usual lunchtime chaos. Groups of students clustered around tables, their voices competing with the clatter of trays and the scraping of chairs against the worn linoleum floor. In the far corner, away from the popular tables and the drama that always seemed to unfold near the vending machines, sat a girl with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She ate her sandwich methodically, her eyes fixed on the sheets of paper spread out beside her lunch tray. To anyone who bothered to look, which hardly anyone did, the papers were covered in strange symbols and lines. Musical notation, the kind that looked more like a foreign language than anything resembling the pop songs that blasted through everyone's headphones. Her earbuds were in, as they always were. Not to be rude or antisocial, but because music was simply where she felt most at home. While her classmates scrolled through social media and gossiped about weekend parties she was never invited to. She listened to Chopin nocturnes and Beethoven sonatas. The melodies transported her away from the fluorescent lights and the smell of institutional pizza. For 3 years now, she had perfected the art of being invisible. It wasn't that she was unpopular in the traditional sense. She wasn't bullied or excluded in any obvious way. She was simply there, like the water fountain by the library or the faded motivational posters in the hallway. People's eyes seemed to slide right past her, never quite landing, never quite seeing. Her teachers knew her as a decent student. Quiet, always turned in her homework, never caused trouble. Her grades were good, but not exceptional. She didn't raise her hand in class discussions or volunteer for group projects. During physical education, she was always picked last for teams. Not because she was particularly bad at sports, but because no one really remembered she was there to be picked. The popular kids had their own world. They moved through the hallways like they owned them, surrounded by friends and laughter and drama. She watched them sometimes, the way you might watch a movie about a life completely different from your own. There was no envy in her observation, just a quiet acceptance that their world and hers existed in parallel, but would never intersect. What her classmates didn't know? What no one at school knew was what happened when she got home each day. While other students were at sports practice or hanging out at the mall or doing whatever it was that normal teenagers did, she descended the stairs to her family's basement. The basement wasn't anything fancy. The concrete walls were painted a practical gray. The floor was covered with industrial carpet remnants. But in the center of the space, positioned under the only window that let in a shaft of afternoon light, stood an upright piano. It was old, the black finish worn at the edges where countless hands had touched it. But it was perfectly tuned, and to her, it was everything. She had been 4 years old when her grandmother first placed her small hands on those keys. Her grandmother had been a piano teacher in the old country. And when the family immigrated, the piano was one of the few possessions they brought with them. It represented hope, culture, something beautiful that couldn't be taken away by circumstance or borders. Every day after school, she practiced, not for an hour like most piano students, for hours. Sometimes 5. Her parents worried sometimes that she was missing out on normal teenage experiences. Shouldn't she be going to football games? Making friends? Going on dates? But when they heard the music flowing up from the basement, complex and emotional and technically brilliant, they understood. This wasn't just a hobby. This was who she was. The pieces she practiced weren't the simple tunes from beginner books. She had moved past those years ago. Now she tackled the giants of classical repertoire, Rachmaninoff sweeping, romantic compositions that required hands that could stretch across impossible distances on the keyboard, lists technically demanding etudes that made even professional pianists nervous. Prokofiev's modern percussive pieces that required both power and precision. Her fingers had developed calluses. Her back sometimes ached from hours at the bench. She had to ice her wrists on particularly intense practice days. But the moment she sat down and began to play, everything else fell away. The loneliness at school, the feeling of being overlooked, the quiet ache of not quite fitting in anywhere, all of it dissolved into the music. When she played, she wasn't the invisible girl from the back of the cafeteria. She was powerful. She was expressing emotions that she couldn't put into words. She was connected to composers who had been dead for centuries. but who understood something fundamental about the human experience. Joy, sorrow, longing, triumph, it was all there in the notes, and her fingers brought it to life. Her music teacher at school, Mrs. Patterson, had noticed something special during the one semester of music class that was required for graduation. The girl had been forced to play a simple melody on the classroom keyboard for an assignment, and even that brief performance had made Mrs. Patterson pause. There was something in the way she approached the instrument, a familiarity and confidence that suggested serious training. Mrs. Patterson had tried to draw her out, asking about her musical background. The girl had been polite but vague. She took lessons. She practiced at home. Nothing special. But Mrs. Patterson's trained ear heard something else. This wasn't a student who took lessons. This was a musician. When the announcement came over the morning PA system about the annual talent show, Mrs. Patterson immediately thought of her quiet student. The talent show was a Roosevelt High tradition, a chance for students to showcase their abilities in front of the entire school. Usually, it was dominated by the same crowd that dominated everything else, confident performers who were comfortable in the spotlight. The sign-up sheet appeared on Mrs. Patterson's classroom door the next day. By the end of the week, it was covered with names. The usual suspects. The girl from the choir who sang at every school event. The junior who did magic tricks. A group of seniors planning an elaborate dance routine. And then, near the bottom of the sheet, written in small, careful handwriting, her name. Mrs. Patterson had to read it twice to make sure she wasn't imagining it. In all her years of teaching, she had never known this girl to volunteer for anything public. She was the student who would rather take a failing grade than give an oral presentation, the one who disappeared during group activities, and now she was signing up to perform in front of the entire school. The next day, Mrs. Patterson pulled her aside after class. Was she sure about this? Did she understand that the whole school would be there? Parents, teachers, students from every grade? The girl had simply nodded, her expression calm. Yes, she understood. Yes, she wanted to do it. What Mrs. Patterson couldn't know, what no one could know, was that something had shifted inside the girl. 3 years of being invisible, of moving through the halls like a ghost, of eating lunch alone while the world buzzed around her, something about it had finally crystallized into a decision. She had spent so long hiding, protecting herself from judgment and rejection by simply not being seen. But the music in her basement wasn't meant to stay hidden. It was meant to be heard. She didn't tell anyone what she planned to play. When Mrs. Patterson asked, she simply said it would be a piano piece. Classical. Nothing more. Mrs. Patterson assumed it would be something safe. Maybe a Mozart sonatina? Perhaps a simple Chopin waltz. Something pretty and pleasant and forgettable. The talent show was still 3 weeks away. In the cafeteria, the girl continued to sit in her corner, earbuds in, sheet music beside her lunch. But now, when she looked at those notes, she was preparing for something different. Not just practice in an empty basement. Performance. The thought terrified and thrilled her. In equal measure, the popular kids were already talking about their acts, planning elaborate costumes and coordinating with friends. They expected applause, attention, validation. They moved through the world expecting to be seen. She expected nothing. But she was ready to be heard. The 3 weeks passed faster than she expected. Each day in the basement became more intense, more focused. Her grandmother sat in the corner during practice sessions now, watching with those knowing eyes that had seen decades of students come and go. Sometimes her grandmother would nod approvingly. Other times, she would stand and place a gentle hand on her shoulder, whispering in their native language about letting the music breathe, about finding the space between the notes where emotion lived. At school, life continued as it always had. The talent show posters appeared in the hallways, bright and colorful, listing all the performers. Her name was there, buried in the middle of the list, and still nobody noticed. During lunch, she overheard conversations from nearby tables. Everyone was talking about the show. Who would win? Who would embarrass themselves? Which acts would be worth watching? The dance crew had been rehearsing in the gym after school, and apparently their routine was incredible. The senior who played guitar had been posting preview videos on social media, already racking up hundreds of likes. There was buzz about the comedy duo who had been making people laugh in the hallways, with snippets from their planned sketch. Nobody mentioned the piano performance. Nobody wondered who would be playing or what they would perform. It was just another name on a list easily skipped over, easily forgotten. The night before the show, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her fingers unconsciously moving through the passages she had memorized. The piece she had chosen wasn't just difficult. It was a statement. It was everything she had ever felt but couldn't say out loud. It's translated into notes and rhythms and dynamics. Her mother came into her room around midnight, finding her still awake. They sat together in the darkness, not saying much. Her mother held her hand, and in that quiet moment, she felt understood in a way that didn't require words. Her mother had always known that her daughter was different, that she experienced the world through a lens that others couldn't quite see through. The piano had been her voice when speaking felt impossible. The day of the talent show arrived with unseasonably warm weather. The kind of spring evening where the air felt full of possibility. Students buzzed with excitement throughout the school day, barely able to focus on their classes. Teachers gave up trying to maintain normal lessons and let the anticipation build. She moved through the day in a strange, calm bubble. While everyone else seemed to vibrate with nervous energy, she felt oddly still. She had done everything she could do. For hours a day, for 3 years, countless scales and arpeggios. Thousands of repetitions of difficult passages until her fingers knew them better than they knew her own name. Now, there was nothing left but to walk out on that stage and play. After the final bell, the gymnasium began its transformation. Parent volunteers hung curtains to create makeshift wings. The maintenance staff rolled out the school's piano from the music room. The same battered upright that had survived decades of beginners and school concerts. It wasn't the beautiful instrument she practiced on at home, but she had tested it earlier in the week. It would do. Mrs. Patterson found her backstage as performers began to arrive. The teacher's face showed concern mixed with excitement. She asked one more time if everything was okay, if she needed anything, if she was feeling prepared. The girl simply nodded and gave a small smile. Mrs. Patterson squeezed her shoulder and went to handle the dozens of other details that required her attention. The gymnasium filled quickly. Students claimed seats in clusters, sitting with their friend groups, already laughing and chatting. Parents filed into the back rows, cameras ready. Teachers lined the sides, playing their unofficial role as chaperones and audience members. By 6:30, every seat was taken, and people stood along the walls. Backstage was chaos. Performers paced back and forth, running through last-minute rehearsals. The dance crew stretched and ran through counts. The singer kept doing vocal warm-ups that sounded like strange animal calls. Someone had already spilled something on their costume and was near tears. The energy was electric, nervous, overwhelming. She sat by herself on a folding chair in the corner, hands resting calmly in her lap. She wasn't running through the piece anymore. She had learned long ago that over-practicing on performance day was worse than not practicing at all. The music was in her fingers, in her muscle memory, in her heart. She closed her eyes and listened to the sounds around her, letting them wash over her without attachment. The show began promptly at 7. The principal walked out to enthusiastic applause and gave a brief welcome speech. Then the first act took the stage. A group of sophomores performing a pop song, complete with choreography they had clearly learned from a music video. The crowd cheered. Parents held up phones to record. It was fun, energetic, exactly what everyone expected. Act after act followed. Some were polished and impressive. Others were charmingly amateur. The audience responded warmly to all of them, appreciating the courage it took to get up on stage. The comedy duo had people laughing so hard that the next performer had to wait for the noise to die down. The dance crew brought down the house with their synchronized routine. The crowd gave them a standing ovation before they even finished. She was scheduled near the middle of the lineup. Not the opening when people were still settling in. And not the closing spot that was traditionally reserved for the most anticipated acts. Just somewhere in the middle. Forgettable placement for a forgettable performance. As the act before her finished, Mrs. Patterson appeared at her side. It was time. She stood, smoothed down her simple black dress, nothing fancy. Just something clean and appropriate, and walked toward the stage entrance. Her heart was beating steadily. Not racing with panic, but present, aware. Alive, she could hear the applause fading as the previous performers left the stage. The principal returned to the microphone to introduce her. He read her name from his card, mispronouncing her last name slightly, and mentioned that she would be playing piano. That was it. No build-up. No special introduction. Just a name and an instrument. As she waited in the wings for her cue to walk out, she glanced at the audience. The gymnasium was packed. Hundreds of faces all turned toward the stage. In the back rows, some students were still chatting with their friends, not particularly interested in a piano performance. A group of junior girls were checking their phones, probably texting about the acts they had already seen. Parents were shifting in their uncomfortable seats, checking the program to see how many more performances they had to sit through. Nobody expected much. She could feel it in the air. The polite anticipation of something that would be nice, but not memorable. Something to clap for before moving on to the next, more exciting act. The principal gestured for her to come out. This was it. She walked onto the stage, her footsteps echoing slightly in the large space. The stage lights were bright, much brighter than she had expected, hot on her face and arms. She couldn't see individual faces in the audience anymore, just shapes and shadows beyond the glare. Somehow that made it easier. The piano sat center stage, waiting. She had played thousands of pianos in her life, but each one was different, had its own personality, its own voice. She approached it like greeting an old friend. Her hands touched the fallboard, feeling the cool, smooth surface. She pulled out the bench and adjusted it to exactly the right height. A practiced motion she had done so many times it was automatic. She sat down, her back straight but not rigid, her shoulders relaxed. She placed her feet on the floor in the correct position, the way her grandmother had taught her when she was 4 years old. Then she lifted her hands and positioned them over the keys. Not touching yet, just hovering, ready in the audience, the conversations continued. People were still settling. Someone coughed. A phone buzzed. The general rustle of a crowd that was present but not particularly attentive. Mrs. Patterson watched from the wings, her hands clasped together nervously. She had heard dozens of student performances over the years. She thought she knew what to expect. Something competent, maybe even good. But ultimately, just another school talent show performance. The girl on stage took one deep breath. She let it out slowly. Then she closed her eyes, blocking out everything: the lights, the crowd, the nerves. The 3 years of invisibility, the fear of judgment, all of it. In that moment of darkness behind her closed eyelids, there was only the music waiting to be born. Her fingers touched the keys and began to play. The first notes rang out into the gymnasium, clear and pure and utterly unexpected. Within seconds, something shifted in the air. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Phones were lowered. The casual, distracted energy of the crowd transformed into something else entirely. Something like shock. The music was nothing like what anyone had expected. This wasn't a simple recital piece. This wasn't a student performance. This was something else entirely, and everyone in that gymnasium felt it instantly. Even if they couldn't name what it was they were feeling, the opening measures of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto filled the gymnasium with a power that seemed impossible from the small upright piano. Her hands moved across the keyboard with absolute certainty, drawing out colors and emotions that the old instrument didn't know it still possessed. The romantic, sweeping melody cascaded through the space. Each note perfectly placed, perfectly timed. Her right hand sang out the iconic theme, while her left hand provided a foundation of rich, rolling chords. This wasn't just playing notes. This was storytelling without words, painting without colors, expressing the inexpressible in the audience. Mouths dropped open. The junior girls who had been texting put their phones down without thinking about it, their attention completely captured. The students in the back row who had been chatting stopped talking. their conversations abandoned mid-sentence. Parents who had been half paying attention while thinking about their grocery lists or work deadlines found themselves leaning forward. Suddenly unable to think about anything except the music pouring from the stage, Mrs. Patterson stood frozen in the wings. One hand covering her mouth, she had taught music for 23 years. She had heard talented students before, but this was different. This wasn't just talent. This was artistry. This was the kind of playing you heard in concert halls, not high school gymnasiums. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized that this girl, this quiet, overlooked student, had been hiding this level of genius all along. On stage, the girl was completely absorbed in the music. Her eyes remained closed. Her face peaceful, but intensely focused. Her body moved with the music, swaying slightly during the lyrical passages, becoming more still and grounded during the powerful sections. Her fingers flew across the keys during the rapid technical passages, moving so fast they seemed to blur. Yet every single note was clear and precise. The piece demanded everything from a pianist. Rachmaninoff had enormous hands and wrote music that reflected that, with chords that stretched across distances that seemed impossible for normal human hands. Yet somehow her smaller hands managed, using technique and intelligence to navigate passages that made professional pianists nervous. There were moments of thundering power, where her whole body engaged with the instrument, pulling out sounds that made the floor vibrate. Then, almost impossibly, she would shift to passages of incredible delicacy, her fingers barely touching the keys, creating sounds so soft and intimate that people in the back rows held their breath, as they wouldn't miss a single note. The popular crowd that dominated every social hierarchy in the school watched in stunned silence. These were students who were used to being the center of attention, the ones everyone looked at, the ones everyone wanted to be. They had walked into this talent show expecting to see the usual performances, probably planning to be on their phones for most of it, definitely not expecting to be moved by anything. But now they sat transfixed. Some of them didn't even particularly like classical music, had never listened to it voluntarily in their lives. But what they were hearing transcended genre or preference. It was simply beautiful, and even teenage cynicism couldn't dismiss it. The class president, who had been planning to leave early to go to a party, found herself unable to move. The star quarterback, who prided himself on being too cool to care about artsy stuff, sat with his arms crossed but his eyes locked on the stage, genuinely impressed. The queen bee of the senior class, who had barely registered that this girl existed, watched with an expression that mixed shock with something that might have been respect. About 3 minutes into the performance, the girl reached the most technically challenging section of the piece. Her hands crossed over each other repeatedly, the right hand diving down into the bass register while the left hand swept up into the treble. The complexity was staggering. Each hand was playing its own complete melody, and together they created a third layer of meaning. Someone in the audience, a parent who actually knew something about classical piano, whispered to the person next to them that this passage was considered one of the most difficult in the romantic piano repertoire. Even conservatory students struggled with it, and here was a high school girl playing it from memory without a single mistake, making it look almost effortless. But it wasn't effortless. It was the result of thousands of hours of work. It was every afternoon spent in that basement, every time her hands ached, every moment when she wanted to quit but pushed through. It was her grandmother's patient guidance and her own stubborn determination. It was choosing the piano over parties, practice over popularity, depth over distraction. As the piece continued, something remarkable happened in the gymnasium. The space itself seemed to transform. It was no longer a place where kids played basketball and had pep rallies. It became, temporarily, a place where something profound was occurring, where a young person was sharing their soul with complete honesty and vulnerability. Some of the parents were crying quietly, not even fully understanding why. There was something about witnessing genuine excellence, genuine passion, that touched something deep in people. In a world full of mediocrity and half-efforts, seeing someone give everything they had to something was unexpectedly moving. The teachers stood along the walls. many of them seeing this girl in a completely new light. The English teacher, who had always thought she was a bit dull, realized that still waters really did run deep. The math teacher, who never would have guessed she had this in her, felt humbled by his own assumptions. Even the principal, who had introduced her with such casual indifference, now watched with his full attention. Realizing that something special was happening on his watch, her fingers continued their dance across the keys. The music swelled and receded like waves, building tension and then releasing it, only to build it again. Rachmaninoff understood human emotion in all its complexity, the way joy and sorrow could exist simultaneously, the way longing could be both painful and beautiful, the way triumph could contain echoes of everything it took to achieve it. And she understood it too. Every note she played carried meaning. This wasn't just mechanical reproduction of what was written on a page. This was interpretation, communication, translation of ink on paper into human feeling. She was telling her own story through Rachmaninoff's notes, expressing everything she had never been able to say in words. The loneliness of being unseen, the joy found in solitary practice, the determination to master something difficult, the love of beauty for its own sake, the courage it took to finally share something so personal. It was all there in the music, and somehow, without understanding exactly how, the audience felt it. About 6 minutes in, she reached a section that was particularly emotional. The melody climbed higher and higher, reaching for something just out of grasp. Yearning and hopeful and heartbreaking all at once. Her touch on the keys was so expressive that the piano seemed to be singing, almost speaking in a language older than words. In the audience, even the most hardened teenage hearts felt something crack open. The boy who always made jokes to cover his insecurity found his throat tight. The girl who acted tough because she was afraid of being vulnerable felt tears threatening to spill. The student who had been dealing with depression and feeling like nothing mattered anymore suddenly felt a spark of something that might have been. Hope music had a way of bypassing all the defenses people built up. It snuck past the walls and spoke directly to the parts of people they tried to hide. And this music played with this level of honesty and skill. It was impossible to resist. Mrs. Patterson noticed something else happening. The girl on stage had changed. Her posture was different. During those first nervous moments when she walked out, there had been a slight hunch to her shoulders, a protective quality. But now, as she played, she sat taller. Her movements were confident, authoritative even. This was her domain. This was where she belonged. On the piano, she was not the invisible girl from the cafeteria. She was not the student who shrank from attention. She was powerful. She was in complete control. She was, in this moment, exactly who she was meant to be. The music built toward its climax. The chords became bigger, fuller, more demanding. Her whole upper body engaged with the effort of pulling these massive sounds from the instrument. The piano rang out, every string vibrating, soundboard resonating with the force of what she was creating, and then, the perfect timing and perfect control, she pulled back. The volume decreased. The energy shifted from outward power to inward reflection. The final section of her arrangement was intimate, tender, like a conversation whispered between close friends. Her fingers moved more slowly now, each note given space to breathe and resonate. The melodies descended, winding down, finding resolution. The tension that had been building for 8 minutes began to release. Not all at once, but gradually, gently, like watching the sun set. The final notes approached. She played them with such care, such love. The last chord hung in the air, sustained by the pedal, slowly fading into silence. Her hands remained on the keys even after the sound had disappeared, as if she wasn't quite ready to let go of the moment. Then finally, she lifted her fingers. She opened her eyes, blinking slightly as she adjusted to the bright lights. She seemed almost surprised to find herself back in the gymnasium, as if she had traveled somewhere far away and was only now returning. For a moment, absolute silence filled the space. Not the awkward silence of confusion, but the profound silence of people who had just experienced something they needed a moment to process. The girl stood up from the piano bench slowly, turning to face the audience that she still couldn't quite see beyond the stage lights, and then the gymnasium exploded. The sound started as a single person clapping, then two, then suddenly everyone was on their feet. The applause wasn't polite or obligatory. It was explosive, genuine, the kind of response that comes from being truly moved by something. Students who never stood for anything were standing. Parents were wiping their eyes while clapping so hard their hands hurt. The ovation rolled over her like a wave. She stood on the stage, slightly stunned, her hands clasped in front of her. She had expected polite applause, maybe even some appreciation. But this was something else entirely. The noise was deafening, echoing off the gymnasium walls, building rather than fading. People were whistling and cheering. The dance crew that had received a standing ovation earlier was on their feet, clapping harder than they had for themselves. The guitar player, who had been so confident about his own performance, stood there shaking his head in amazement, a huge grin on his face. Even the students who had been too cool to care about anything were applauding with real enthusiasm. She gave a small bow, the way her grandmother had taught her. Not too deep, not too showy, just a simple acknowledgement of the audience's response. Her cheeks were flushed pink, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. For someone who had spent 3 years trying not to be noticed, being seen by everyone all at once was overwhelming. But it was the good kind of overwhelming. The kind that made her heart race and her eyes prickle with tears she refused to let fall. Not tears of sadness, but of something bigger. Recognition. Maybe validation. The feeling of finally being understood by people who had looked through her for so long. The applause continued. 30 seconds. 45. A full minute. The principal had to walk back out on stage, smiling broadly, and gesture for people to settle down so the show could continue. Even then, as she walked off stage, people were still clapping, still on their feet. As soon as she stepped into the wings, Mrs. Patterson was there. The teacher pulled her into a tight hug, not caring about professional boundaries or proper behavior. She was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. She pulled back and held the girl by her shoulders, looking at her with a mixture of pride and something like, "That was extraordinary," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking. "In 23 years of teaching, I have never heard a student play like that. Never." The girl didn't know what to say. She had poured everything into that performance, and now she felt oddly empty and full at the same time. Like a vessel that had given away its contents, but somehow ended up with more than it started with. Other performers crowded around her. People who had barely acknowledged her existence before now wanted to talk to her, congratulate her, tell her how amazing she was. The attention was strange and unfamiliar, but their enthusiasm seemed genuine. The dance crew leader, a popular senior who had never spoken to her before, gave her a high five and said it was the most incredible thing she'd ever seen at a school event, but she needed a moment to breathe, to process what had just happened. She slipped away from the backstage crowd and found a quiet corner near the exit. Through the door, she could hear the next act starting, but the energy had shifted. People were still buzzing about what they had just witnessed. She could hear snatches of conversation floating back. "Did you know she could play like that? I didn't even know who she was. That was literally insane. I'm going to tell everyone about this." Her phone, which she had silenced and left in her bag, was already lighting up with notifications. During her performance, multiple parents had recorded videos. Some had already posted them too. Social media with captions like "Hidden talent at our school talent. Show, and you have to see this." The views were climbing rapidly as people shared the videos with friends and family. The rest of the talent show continued. But nothing could match what had just happened. The performers who went after her did their best, and they were good. But everyone in the audience was still processing what they had heard. The final act finished around 9 o'clock, and the judges went to deliberate. She sat backstage with the other performers, mostly quiet while chaos swirled around her. Some of the students kept glancing at her, like they were seeing her for the first time, and trying to reconcile the invisible girl from school, the person who had just commanded that stage. When the judges returned, everyone gathered for the awards ceremony. There were prizes for different categories, certificates, and small trophies that the school had been giving out for years. Best comedy act, best dance performance, best vocal performance. Each winner received enthusiastic applause. Then came the overall winner, the best performance of the night. The principal opened the envelope, but everyone already knew. There was no suspense, no question. The entire gymnasium erupted before he even finished saying her name. She walked back onto the stage, this time with less fear, and accepted the trophy. It was small and inexpensive, probably cost $20 at a trophy shop. But she held it like it was made of gold. The crowd's response was even bigger than before. People weren't just clapping. They were shouting her name, some of them for the first time ever, saying it out loud. She looked out at the sea of faces, and for a moment she felt truly seen, not as the quiet girl who sat alone, but as a complete person with depth and talent and something valuable to offer the world. After the ceremony ended, the gymnasium slowly emptied, but people kept approaching her. Parents introduced themselves and asked where she studied, how long she had been playing, whether she planned to pursue music professionally. Some of them were musicians themselves and wanted to talk about the technical aspects of what she had done. Others just wanted to thank her for sharing something so beautiful. Her own parents found her in the crowd, both of them beaming with pride. Her father, who rarely showed strong emotion, had tears in his eyes. Her mother hugged her tight and whispered in their language that her grandmother would have been so proud. Actually, her grandmother was proud she was standing right there. A small woman with steel in her spine, nodding with satisfaction like this, was exactly what she had always known would happen. The popular kids approached too, and this was perhaps the strangest part. These students who had formed the social elite of Roosevelt High, who decided who mattered and who didn't, now looked at her with genuine respect. The class president asked if she would consider playing at graduation. The student council vice president wanted to know if she would perform at other school events. The girl who ruled the senior class social scene said, with apparent sincerity, that she wished they had known each other sooner. Some of the interactions felt shallow. People suddenly wanting to be associated with something impressive. But others felt real. A few students, the quieter ones, who also existed on the margins of high school's social life, told her that watching her perform had inspired them, that seeing someone like them, someone who didn't fit the typical mold, do something extraordinary made them feel like maybe they had something extraordinary in them too. As the crowd thinned out, she found herself talking with a group of younger students, freshmen and sophomores, who had been in the audience. They asked her questions about piano, about how she learned, about how she got over being nervous. She answered them honestly, surprised to find that talking about music with people who were genuinely interested wasn't as hard as talking about other things. One freshman girl, small and shy with glasses that kept sliding down her nose, lingered after the others left. She admitted that she played violin but had been thinking about quitting because she didn't think she was good enough, and because none of her friends understood why she spent so much time practicing. But watching tonight's performance had changed her mind. She wanted to keep going now. She wanted to see if she could find that same kind of connection with music. The girl told her not to quit. She explained that the hours alone with an instrument weren't wasted, even when it felt lonely. That building something meaningful took time and sacrifice, and that was okay. That being different from everyone else wasn't a weakness. It was just being yourself. The freshman nodded seriously, like she was receiving wisdom from someone much older and wiser. Even though they were only separated by 3 years, by 10 o'clock the gymnasium was mostly empty. The maintenance crew was already taking down decorations and folding up chairs. Mrs. Patterson helped her pack up her things. Still unable to stop talking about the performance, already making plans for college recommendations in music, school auditions. As she walked out to the parking lot with her parents and grandmother, the spring air felt different than it had that morning. Warmer maybe, or just more alive. She carried her small trophy in one hand and her bag in the other. Above them, stars scattered across the clear sky. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear music playing from a car radio. Her father drove them home through quiet streets. Nobody said much, but it was a comfortable silence. The kind that came after something important had happened and words would only diminish it. Her phone continued to buzz with notifications. Friend requests from people she had never spoken to. Comments on videos she hadn't watched yet. Messages of congratulations from distant relatives who had somehow already heard. When they got home, she went straight to the basement. Not to practice, but just to sit at the piano bench in the quiet and stillness. She placed her hands on the keys without pressing down, just feeling the familiar coolness under her fingers. Tomorrow, she would go back to school, and everything would be different. People would know her name. They would talk to her in the hallways. She would no longer be invisible. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. But tonight, in this moment, she was just grateful. Grateful for the music that had always been her refuge. Grateful for the chance to share it. Grateful for the grandmother who had placed her hands on these keys when she was 4 years old, and shown her a way to speak without words. She played a few soft notes. Nothing formal, just fragments of melody drifting into the air. Upstairs, she could hear her parents talking quietly, their voices warm with happiness. Outside, the world continued spinning, full of people who now knew something about her they hadn't known before. But down here in the basement, with her piano and her music and her hard-won peace, nothing had really changed at all. She was still exactly who she had always been. The only difference was that now, other people could see it too. Monday morning arrived with the kind of nervous energy that made her stomach flip as she walked through the school's front doors. She had spent the entire weekend watching her phone blow up with notifications. Her performance video spreading far beyond Roosevelt High. Friends of friends had shared it, then strangers. By Sunday evening, the main video had over 300,000 views and was still climbing. Local news stations had called her house asking for interviews. A reporter from the city paper wanted to write a feature story about the piano prodigy hiding in plain sight. Her email inbox had messages from music teachers, conservatory representatives, even a few professional musicians who wanted to tell her how moved they had been by her playing, but none of that prepared her for walking into school that Monday. The hallway conversation stopped as she passed. Not in a mean way, but in a wave of recognition. People called out to her, some using her name for the first time ever. "That was amazing. You're incredible. I watched your video like 10 times. She smiled and nodded, still not quite sure how to handle being the center of attention. At her locker, a group of sophomore girls approached nervously. They wanted to know if she gave lessons. Their parents had seen the video, and now suddenly everyone wanted their kids to learn piano. She explained that she had never taught before, but gave them Mrs. Patterson's information instead. The girls thanked her like she had given them something precious and hurried off, whispering excitedly to each other. First period was strange. Her English teacher, who had barely called on her all year, asked if she would be willing to share her thoughts on the poetry they were studying. The connection between music and poetry, he said, would be valuable for the class to hear. She spoke briefly about rhythm and emotion, and her classmates actually listened. Some of them even took notes. At lunch, she headed toward her usual corner table. But before she could sit down, voices called out to her. The popular crowd was waving her over to their table. For a moment, she froze. This was the table she had watched from a distance for 3 years. The social center of the school, where the students who mattered sat. She walked over cautiously. They made room for her, genuinely welcoming, asking her to sit with them. The conversation flowed around her questions about her playing, how long she had been practicing, where she learned what other pieces she knew. They wanted to understand this part of her they had never seen. It would have been easy to sit there and soak in the attention. To finally be part of the group that defined social success at Roosevelt High. But as she sat listening to them talk about weekend parties and social media drama and who was dating who, she realized something important. This wasn't her world. It never had been, and that was okay. She stayed for lunch. Polite and friendly, but when they invited her to sit with them again tomorrow, she gave a non-committal smile. Maybe sometimes, she said. But she liked her quiet corner too. They seemed to respect that, nodding like they understood something they couldn't quite put into words. Over the following days, the initial frenzy began to settle into something more sustainable. Yes, people knew who she was now. Yes, they smiled at her in the hallways, and included her in conversations. But the novelty faded as life moved on, as it always does. The next drama captured everyone's attention. The next big thing happened. What didn't fade was the shift in how she saw herself. Mrs. Patterson pulled her aside on Wednesday to discuss opportunities. Several prestigious summer music programs wanted her to apply. Scholarship offers were coming in from colleges she had never dreamed of attending. The teacher had contact with a professional pianist who wanted to give her a private lesson to assess her abilities. The doors that had always been closed were suddenly opening wide. But the most meaningful changes weren't the big opportunities or the social media fame. They were smaller, more personal. A group of students approached her about starting a music club. Something beyond the standard band and choir. A place where students who loved music could share what they were working on, learn from each other, support each other. They wanted her to help lead it. She said yes. The freshman girl with the violin, the one who had almost quit, started meeting her once a week in the music room. Not formal lessons exactly, but conversations about music and practice and finding motivation when things got hard. Soon, other students joined. A junior who played cello, a sophomore working on guitar, even a senior who wrote songs but had been too shy to share them. These informal gatherings became the best part of her week. She discovered that she enjoyed helping others find their voice through music, the same way her grandmother had helped her. Teaching forced her to articulate things she had always known instinctively, and in doing so, she understood her own playing better. The video of her performance continued to spread, eventually reaching over 1 million views. Occasionally, she would scroll through the comments. Many were from musicians who analyzed her technique and interpretation. Others were from people who knew nothing about classical music but had been moved by what they heard. Some comments came from other quiet, overlooked kids who said watching her performance gave them courage to share their own hidden talents. Those comments meant more to her than all the scholarship offers and news, interviews combined. The idea that her moment of vulnerability and courage had inspired others to be brave. That ripple effect was something she had never anticipated. Her grandmother, watching all of this unfold, seemed satisfied but not surprised. She had always known what her granddaughter was capable of. One evening, as they sat together at the piano, the old woman placed her weathered hand over her granddaughter's young one. "Music is not about being seen," her grandmother said in their native language. "It is about being honest. You were honest that night. That is why people responded." Those words stayed with her. Being seen had never been the goal. Being honest was what mattered. Being willing to share something real in a world full of pretense and performance and carefully curated images. She continued to practice 4 hours a day in the basement, just as she always had. Not because she was chasing fame or success, but because that was who she was. The piano was still her refuge, her way of processing the world, her method of expression when words failed. Senior year came and went. She did end up performing at graduation, playing as the seniors walked across the stage to receive their diplomas. She applied to several conservatories and was accepted to all of them with full scholarships. She chose a prestigious program on the East Coast, a place where she could study with masters and be surrounded by other serious musicians. But before she left for college, she made sure the music club she had helped start was in good hands. The freshman violinist, now a sophomore, had grown so much in confidence that she agreed to help lead it. The group had expanded to 20 regular members, all of them supporting each other's musical journeys. On her last day at Roosevelt High, she went to the gymnasium one final time. The space was empty and quiet, so different from that night of the talent show. She stood on the stage where everything had changed, remembering the fear and the courage and the moment. When she decided to let people see who she really was, she thought about the girl who had walked onto this stage just over a year ago. That girl had been invisible, uncertain, hiding behind her hair and her silence. Not because she was weak, because she was protecting something precious until she was ready to share it. That girl was still part of her, would always be part of her. The quiet observer, the dedicated practitioner, the person who found meaning in solitude and depth and silence. But now there was more. Now there was a girl who knew that hiding wasn't the same as protecting, and that sharing your gifts with the world didn't diminish them, it multiplied them. As she left the gymnasium and walked out into the late spring sunshine, she thought about all the hours in the basement, all the sacrifice, all the time she had chosen practice over parties and dedication over distraction. Every single hour had been worth it, not because they led to fame or recognition, but because they led to mastery, to understanding herself, to having something real to offer when the moment came. College would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to grow. She would meet people who were just as talented, just as dedicated. She would no longer be the exceptional one in a regular high school, but a regular student in an exceptional program. And that was exactly what she wanted to be: pushed, challenged, surrounded by excellence. But she would also take with her the lessons from Roosevelt High. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. That being different isn't a flaw, it's often where the most interesting people live. That the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the invisible ones, they often have the most profound things to say, if anyone bothers to listen. And most importantly, she learned that you don't need everyone to see you. You just need to see yourself clearly, to know your own worth, to honor your own gifts. Everything else is just noise. Years later, when she performed in concert halls around the world, when critics praised her interpretations and audiences gave her standing ovations, she would sometimes think back to that high school gymnasium, to the moment when a quiet girl walked onto a stage and decided to be heard. That moment hadn't made her who she was. She had already been that person, fully formed, deeply talented, complete in herself. The performance had simply revealed what was always there, waiting for the right moment to emerge into the light. And in the end, that was the real lesson. You don't become extraordinary by seeking attention or approval from others. You become extraordinary by being faithful to what matters to you, by developing your gifts in private, by putting in the hours when no one is watching. Then, when the moment comes, and the moment always comes, if you're ready for it to step forward, you share what you've built, you offer what you have, and the world, if you've done the work honestly and completely, has no choice but to listen. She closed the basement door on her last day at home before leaving for college, her packed bags waiting upstairs. The piano sat silent in the dim light, its keys gleaming faintly. It had been her teacher, her therapist, her best friend. Her voice when she had no other way to speak. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room, to the instrument, to all the hours they had spent together. Then she turned off the light and climbed the stairs, toward whatever came next, carrying with her everything that really mattered, not the trophy or the fame or the scholarship or the million views, but the music itself and the courage to share it. Those were the gifts that would last forever.